Which of your facts will be demolished.
Russia's current leaders are not simply the political rulers of their nation. They are literally the country's owners.
You don't know which of your arguments will be totally destroyed.
I'm not prepared to sacrifice the African continent for some free market neoliberal ideology.
And then you got to come back and you're now rattled, you're shaken up.
Let's save the bleeding heart for somebody else. It's time to change.
And you don't know what the hell to say, but you got to say something.
I believe the 21st century will belong to China because most centuries have belonged to China.
Blaming Barack Obama for the state that the world is in right now is like blaming a Caribbean island for a hurricane.
The lesson of North Korea has been if you're a third-rate dysfunctional country that manages to acquire a couple of crude nuclear devices, you remain a third-world dysfunctional country with a couple of crude nuclear devices.
Are you seriously saying, Mr. Trudeau, will you never be able to revoke citizenship from somebody?
Mr. Harbour, against this country. A Canadian is a Canadian, and you devalue the citizenship of every Canadian in this country.
Thank you. Welcome to the Munk debate on the global refugee crisis. My name is Rudyard Griffiths, and I have the privilege of organizing this semi-annual debate series and once again serving as your moderator. I want to begin tonight's proceedings by welcoming the North American-wide TV audience that is tuning into this debate right now across Canada from coast to coast to coast on CPAC, Canada's Public Affairs channel, and across the continental United States on C-SPAN. It's the first time the Munk Debates really, again, has been live throughout the continent of North America, and it's terrific to have that viewing audience joining us this evening. A warm hello also to our online audience. They're logging on to this debate right now on our website, www.munkdebates.com. It's great to have you as virtual participants in tonight's proceedings, and terrific to have readers of the Globe and Mail, our print media partner, joining us also online. We've got an online poll going tonight. Be sure to participate. Be sure to be part of our online interactive discussion. And finally, hello to you, the over 3,000 people who've once again filled Roy Thompson Hall on a Friday night to capacity for yet another Munk debate. All of us associated with the Aurea Foundation, we thank you for your support for the simple idea that this debate series is dedicated to. That's more and better public debate in the public square. So bravo, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being part of tonight's conversation. Now, our ability, debate in and debate out year after year, to bring some of the world's sharpest minds and brightest thinkers here to the stage at Toronto's Roy Thompson Hall would not be possible without the generosity, the foresight, the creativity of our host tonight. Please join me in a warm appreciation of the Aurea Foundation and its founders, Peter and Melanie Munk. Bravo, guys. Well, the moment we've been waiting for. Let's get our two teams of debaters out here, center stage, and our debate underway. Our resolution, taken from the inscription, the Statue of Liberty. Be it resolved, give us, you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Please welcome our first speaker for the resolution. She's a former Canadian Supreme Court Justice, Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and a United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, among many other accomplishments. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Canada's Louise Arbour. So glad we could do this. Thank you. Now, Louise's teammate is an internationally acclaimed historian, cultural commentator and art critic. Please welcome big thinker Simon Schama. Thank you, Simon. Well, one great team of debaters deserves another. Speaking against the resolution, be it resolved, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, is the renowned columnist, author, and conservative human rights activist, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Steyn. Well, Mark's debating partner is the leader of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, and a member of the European Parliament. He's here tonight from the United Kingdom. Under his leadership, UKIP won almost 4 million votes in the 2015 national election in the UK. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nigel Farage. Okay, before our debate begins, I need your help with just some last-minute items. One, power up your smartphones. For those of you here, those watching online, we have a hashtag tonight, Munk Debate, #Munk Debate. Let's make this the #1 trending topic in North America. You can also take part in our rolling poll. For those of you, again, watching online, we have a poll, www.monkdebates.com/vote. You can vote and participate in tonight's debate via the web. Now, our countdown clock, an invention we love at the Munk Debates. It keeps us on time, it keeps us on schedule, it keeps our debaters on their toes. When you see these clocks reach their final moments, we'll count down to 0. Join me in a round of applause, and that again will let our debaters know that their time is up. And, well, we had Henry Kissinger. He didn't think his time was up. He kept talking. Thought he was being so brilliant, but I digress. I don't think any of our debaters will make the same mistake. Now, this is the part I enjoy most. We asked all of you, 3,000 of you assembled, to vote on the resolution on your way in. You were asked, do you support or oppose the motion? Be it resolved, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. Let's see if we've got those results for you to look at. Okay, 77% agree. 23% disagree. Now, to give a sense of how much this debate is in play, depending on what you hear during the debate, are you open to changing your votes? Let's see that result. Wow, 79-21. So this debate is very much in play. Either side can take it. Let's now go to our opening statements. I'd like 6 minutes on the clock for each of our debaters. Ms. Arbour, your 6 minutes begins now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The words of the motion that I'm here to support were written by a woman, Emma Lazarus. And these words are engraved on a famous statue representing a woman holding a torch, and maybe less noticeably holding also the tablets of law with a broken chain at her feet. So it should come as no surprise to you that this has considerable appeal to me. But don't let that fool you. This is not a sentimental call for do-gooders to unite, nor a romantic projection of what the new world is going to be all about. Understood in today's term, it's a moving, poetic way of capturing both the spirit and the letter of the Refugee Convention. The 1951 Refugee Convention was written essentially because and for Europe, and it remains the framework within which a world purporting to be governed by the rule of law must deal with the current refugee crisis in Europe and must also stop turning a blind eye to equally pressing crises elsewhere, in South Sudan, for instance. This is part of the never again that the world screamed loud and clear after the Holocaust and betrayed on so many occasions since then. So today should not be one of those. I want to look at this issue both from a Canadian and from an international perspective. The international framework is very clear. Virtually all the countries that are concerned with the current flow of refugees fleeing war-torn countries of Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya are parties to the Refugee Convention, and they are obligated to grant asylum to those fleeing political and other forms of persecution. The protection framework that is set in place by the Convention provides that refugees should not be penalized for their illegal entry or stay in a country. The reverse would obviously be a way to completely emasculate the right of asylum. And the principle of non-refoulement precludes returning refugees to countries where they are at risk. This obviously puts a disproportionate demand on countries that are more easily reachable than others, such as, in the case of Syria, the neighboring countries of Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, in which there are currently some 4.5 million Syrian refugees, as well as the countries that are at the external borders of Europe, Greece, Italy, and so on. So this leads to another fundamental principle which underpins the Refugee Convention, that is the need for international cooperation in burden sharing. And I'm cautious here in using the word burden. This brings me to Canada. We often define ourselves by our geography. Once again, on this issue, our geography is relevant. The nature of our borders is such that we are virtually immune from a flow of asylum seekers arriving on our soil by land or sea. Although apparently the result of the upcoming American elections may change that, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. I believe that this puts on us a special obligation to provide for a generous resettlement program aiming both at welcoming refugees and at easing the burden on states who are struggling to live up to their international obligations. And I believe with true international cooperation in place, this is eminently feasible. And we should do it the smart way by ensuring that asylum seekers can travel safely to places of refuge, thereby undercutting the smugglers, and by deploying extraordinary resources to meet this extraordinary challenge. I am aware of the fear that an influx of foreigners will transform our social fabric in an undesirable way. But the reality is that our social fabric is changing anyway in this increasingly interconnected world. We have a choice. We could look to the past and stagnate in isolation, or we can embrace a future in which our children will develop their own culture, fully open to that of others, inspired by the choices that we are making today. The greatest threat to Western values is not an influx of people who may not share them today. It's the hypocrisy of those claiming to protect these values and then repudiating them by their actions. I expect that we're going to hear tonight that Muslims are different, that they pose a unique, novel, and existential threat to our democracies. Not only has this been the ugly response to just about every wave of new immigrant in history, but ironically, it plays right into the hands of the violent jihadist groups that are attacking us. These violent groups have a political, not a religious agenda. They seek to destroy our democracies, not by infiltrating or taking over our institutions, but by letting us slowly self-implode in response to the fear that risks turning us against ourselves, thereby destroying the very key features of our open society. We need to be smarter than that, and we need to welcome people who, like all of us who came at some point from somewhere else, will build an ever-evolving, free, and strong Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Time still on the clock. So, Mark Steyn, you're up next. Your 6 minutes begins now.
Madam Arbour described a refugee situation that is not what is happening in Europe at the moment. The great question before us tonight is whether the huddled masses on those teeming shores are really yearning to breathe free, or whether they're simply economic migrants who want to avail themselves of the comforts of advanced societies, as we all would. There are 3,000 people here in Roy Thomson Hall, and it would be nice if everyone in Toronto could be in Roy Thomson Hall. But if everyone in Toronto moves into Roy Thomson Hall, it isn't Roy Thomson Hall anymore. And that's the situation that is faced in Europe today. The people who have entered Europe are not refugees, as that term has traditionally been understood, and as Madame Arbour explained in terms of the Geneva Convention. In 2015, in Europe, men represented 77% of the asylum applications. That's an extraordinary population deformation. In most civil wars, this is the demographic that would be back home fighting for their country. It's as if during the American Revolution, General Washington and the rest of the chaps had gone off to France and left Martha and the other women and children back home to fend for themselves. What does it mean to breathe free? Under the Taliban, it's illegal for Madame Arbour to feel sunlight on her face. It's literally a crime for her to, quote, breathe free. She can breathe only through a mask approved by the man who in effect owns her. So what happens when you put a man from that kind of society in, say, a Scandinavian town? Northern Europe has enjoyed a culture of mixed public bathing since the 19th century, but a benign social activity to Germans and Scandinavians is something entirely different to men from a culture where women are chattels. So female patrons of public baths are now routinely assaulted. And in January, Sweden's national swimming arena was forced for the first time to segregate men and women in the hot tubs. So goodbye to a century-old tradition. Migrant rights trump your culture. Our response is, oh, they come from a different culture. They don't know that you're not meant to grope women's breasts. So in Germany, they put up pictograms with a breast and a groping hand and a red X through it. Last month, a mere fortnight after acing a training course on how to treat women with respect, a 15-year-old Afghan dragged a caterer at a Belgian refugee centre into the basement and raped her. Well, we'll fine-tune the course on treating women with respect. We'll get better pictograms. But in the meantime, migrant rights trump women's rights. Madame Arbour was the first prosecutor ever to charge rape as a crime against humanity. In 2007, she published an important report on the use of rape in Sudan as a weapon of war. It was a distressing report. She documented 15 individual cases of sexual assault, including rape, and victims as young as 14. If Madame Arbour were to publish a similar report on Germany today, she'd be able to cite more than 500 cases from just one night in just one town, Cologne on New Year's Eve, and victims as young as 3 years old. A 3-year-old raped by a migrant. A 7-year-old girl was gang raped by 5 migrants in Hamburg just a few days ago. On Wednesday, a schoolgirl was gang raped on the ferry from Sweden to Finland. Migrant rights now trump children's rights. What a pity Madame Arbour's successor at the UN isn't interested in producing a report on that rape epidemic. The police chief of Vienna has advised women that it's no longer safe to go out unaccompanied. Migrant rights trump the right to freedom of movement. It's easy to shrug, oh, well, it's just a few disabled kids, just anecdotes. So forget the anecdotes and run the numbers. In Europe, with unaccompanied minors, 90% are male, which means that in 1 year, Swedish adolescents now have a more distorted sex differential than China does after 30 years of its totalitarian one-child policy. In China, there are 119 boys for every girl. Among Swedish adolescents, Just from the last year's importation, it is now 123 boys for every girl. That's a fact of life. And I hope tonight we'll put aside the sentimentalism that often attends this subject and stick with the facts. Madame Arbour said some things that I agree with. She said recently, why are we always talking about the danger that these people will transform us? They may transform us for the better. So she and I agree that immigration on this scale is transformative. The only difference is that Madame Arbour thinks it's for the better, and I don't. And I'm genuinely curious to know what aspects of Afghan and Syrian and Sudanese culture that she would like us to be transformed by. Women's rights, fast-track justice whereby gays get thrown off rooftops, polygamy, child brides, clitoridectomies, the bracing commitment to free speech. I would like an answer on that from Madame Arbour tonight. Thank you very much.
Simon Schama, over to you.
Well, I want to start by saying, oh, Canada, your borders are safe. I can tell you why, because actually I was asked this morning at Toronto Airport what I was doing here, and I said, well, I've come to talk about refugees and migrants. I was immediately taken off for secondary screening, actually. So it's not only dangerous to talk about this, it's dangerous to be known to be talking about it. Look, those lines are written by Emma Lazarus. She was a Sephardi Jewess. She was a wealthy woman in New York. And she wrote them in 1883 after looking at the victims of Russian pogroms who come to America and having suffered horrendous atrocities committed against them in Kishinev and Odessa and Elizaveta and saw them on Ward's Island. And she didn't make a distinction between economic migrants. By the way, your number is wrong. It's not 77%. We know from United Nations agencies and the Pew it's 61%, and that's a significant... this is an uninterrupted moment. We'll have rebuttal time afterwards. I know radio hosts don't usually like that, but that's the case. She did that because actually when you are fleeing from a place of cruelty and atrocity, your house has been blown up, your whole possibility of livelihood's been taken away from you. Your children have no food, no medicine. What are you exactly? You're terrifyingly running away from catastrophe. And the vast numbers of Syrians who displaced, 4 million of them internally displaced, as those who are escaping the hell of Libya and Somalia and Afghanistan, are fleeing exactly the monsters of Islamofascism that Mark accurately describes. They are not their friends. They're not their secret co-conspirators. They are horrified. They're trying to get away from that culture. Now, it's fine to say, well, in those days, and as the reason actually why the lines from Emma Lazarus' New Colossus were not immediately put on the Statue of Liberty, they were only put there in 1903 as a result of the efforts of her friend, Georgina Schuyler, was because at that very time there was a ferocious agitation on the part of something called the Immigration Restriction League and its British equivalent called the League of British Brothers, all of whom said the unwashed, the filthy, those who do not share our language, our religion, our values, are about to destroy the white race. Madison Grant wrote a book called The Suicide of the White Race. Tom Watson, the populist, described the millions of distressed as the scum of creation. Nonetheless, the United States, as an honor to its tradition, set out in Krevker's What is an American in 1782, admitted 5 million of those refugees between 1880 and 1890. And the argument will be made that, well, in those days, democracy was more confident. I agree with you, absolutely, about that. It was more articulate, it was less defensive, it was more forthright. And besides, people coming from Eastern Europe or Central Europe did not bear democracy the grudge. They didn't want to overthrow it. Yes, they did. Yes, they did. Those teeming millions that Emma Lazarus emotionally described were full of anarchists and communists dedicated to the overthrow of capitalism, but liberal capitalism was strong enough to let them in anyway. And as a result, the American Republic and Great Britain thrived and flourished and prospered, and my own grandparents were among those who had Britain to thank for that more expansive view of what democracy could accommodate. We're talking about a drop in the ocean, really, now. There are 1 billion of us in Europe and Canada and the United States. We're talking about 20,000 being admitted to Britain. We're talking about 100,000 refugees in the United States proposed by the president, of whom only 25,000 will come from Syria. And the issue is, are they all kind of ravening sexual monsters of Mark Steyn's X-rated horror with, Muslims are not all Salafists. You know they're not all Salafists. Not actually all Salafists are jihadis either. There are quietist Salafists. Do Salafist jihadis pose a mortal threat? You bet your life they do. There is a real war of that kind going on. But what do we do to actually resist the poison of apocalyptic millenarians? The answer is not to demonize all of Muslims, but actually to engage with them. And we say, well, who are we engaging with? There are no Muslims who really want to stand up. That is not true. After the attack, both in Paris and Brussels, 150 imams, actually in Europe, got up and made a statement of the abhorrence of the act. There are even Quranic scholars, the greatest of whom is Javed Ahmed Hamidi. If you don't know his work, look it up, who is absolutely dedicated to denouncing jihadism as a perversion of the Quran. And I just want to say that it can't possibly be true that you can't have a pluralist Muslim adoption of Western norms. In Britain, Nigel, we've lived with that for years and years before jihadism became the monstrosity that it is now. My greengrocer is a Kurdish Muslim. You turn on the radio in the morning and you hear Raisa Iqbal for the BBC. My local newsagent tells me when to look at the Jewish Chronicle, and his name is Ahmed.
Fascinating. Nigel.
Well, thank you, and good evening, everybody. If we're going to discuss the global refugee crisis, we better use the EU as a case study. But we must start by asking ourselves, what is a refugee? Now, I speak as a family of refugees. We were French Protestants being burned at the stake for our political opinions, something many in Westminster would perhaps like to bring back today, I'm sure. And I come from a country that is, I think, there is no country in Europe that needs lectures about looking after refugees. The Brits have done it better than anybody else. We've done it with Jewish people. We've done it with Ugandan Asians. But what is a refugee? This 1951 convention that we've just talked about earlier. It's a person with a well-founded fear of persecution because of their race, religion, political opinions, or orientation, who are outside their own country and fear returning to it. Now look, I know it's tempting to support this motion. It sounds wonderful. Give us your poor, your weak, your huddled masses. And in doing so, we can perhaps feel a sense of our own moral superiority. But just look where that idea has got the EU in the course of the last year. Jean-Claude Juncker, the unelected European Commission President, who I have to say, after a good lunch is rather fun to be with, particularly if I be with him, actually. But Juncker has changed the definition of what a refugee is to include people who come from war-torn areas. And given that the UNHCR say there are currently 59 million people displaced in the world, That's quite a big number. But Juncker's taken it even broader. He said to qualify as a European refugee if you come from extreme poverty. And that would mean perhaps 3 billion people could possibly come to Europe. All of this, of course, was massively compounded by Chancellor Merkel, who effectively did say, give us your weak and your poor and your huddled masses, in what I think has proved to be the worst foreign policy decision in Europe since 1945. Because her moral superiority was, in my view, based on still a level of war guilt that exists in Germany. But she opened up the doors, and 1 million people came in last year. But virtually none of them would qualify as refugees on any classical definition. And in fact, most of them that came were somewhat aggressive young males who, when they arrived and got through the border, punched the air and chanted, rather like football supporters. I remember as a young man watching the BBC and seeing Ugandan Asians landing on the tarmac at Heathrow, humble, thankful, and promising that they would repay the debt Britain had shown them by integrating and becoming part of our society. Sadly, that is not what has happened. And there is nobody on this side of the argument trying to say that Islam is bad or all Muslims are bad. We are not saying that. But what we are saying is that if you allow a very large number of young males to come to European countries, and if they come from a culture where women are at best second-class citizens, don't be surprised to see the abominations such as that we saw outside Cologne train station on New Year's Eve. And don't be surprised that the formerly rather sleepy Swedish city of Malmö has now become the rape capital of Europe. But that is as nothing compared to what the boss of Europol said 3 weeks ago. He said there are now 5,000 jihadi fighters, every one of them potentially a terrorist, that have got back into Europe through the Greek islands posing as migrants. When ISIS say they will use the migrant routes to destroy the civilization of Europe, I suggest we start to take them seriously. And the difference between what is going on now and any other either migratory wave or refugee wave in the history of mankind that I can see is that never before have we had a fifth column, albeit a small one, thank God, but a fifth column living within our communities that hates us, wants to kill us, and wants to overturn our complete way of life. I believe that we in the West should give people refugee status, and throughout this whole tragedy of what has gone on in the Middle East and North Africa, not one person in serious level of politics has dared to speak up for the Christians in Iraq and the Christians in Syria, who are now only 10% of what they were just a few years ago. They qualify for refugee status because they're being persecuted for who they are. We have to oppose this motion. This motion, at best, is impractical and at worst poses a threat to our entire way of life. I want us to have a proper processing mechanism. I want us to do all the things we've done, as Brits particularly over centuries. I want us to welcome genuine refugees, not the disaster that is engulfing much of Europe today. Thank you.
Very strong opening statements from the group, so thank you. We're now going to go into timed rebuttals so we can get some quick reaction from each team. Ms. Arbour, we'll put 2 minutes on the clock for you. Give us your reaction to what you've heard from the other side.
All right, 2 issues. First of all, on the definition of refugees. I think in the current climate of warfare, the current state of armed conflict, in my opinion, virtually every civilian in a war theater that is not a combatant qualifies for refugee protection unless he is excluded by the convention as a war criminal. And the reality of it is that the protection of civilians currently in armed conflict is non-existent. They are targeted by all sides, and therefore, I think for the most part, they qualify for refugee protection. Now, the suggestion that what we see, these waves of young men coming into Europe, are all economic migrants, frankly, it's hard to believe why these economic migrants would have paid thousands of dollars for the privilege of drowning in the Mediterranean, but that's another issue. Let me just address very briefly, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to return to that, to the issues raised by these newborn feminists there. And I see the clock running, so I reserve my right to flesh out these ideas a little more deeply, but I can assure you that for those of us feminists who came, certainly the women of my generation, from a cultural, political environment in this country in which religion dictated most of our rights and privileges, we've managed to start occupying our place in public life, not by pushing and trying to exclude others, and certainly not by espousing as champions people who have that kind of ideology.
Thank you. Okay. I want to hear from the pro team back-to-back. So Simon, let's have your rebuttal, and then I'll come on to Mark and Nigel.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just struck by how obsessed with sex these two guys are, really, actually. It's a bit sad, really, actually. I don't know, I just want to make the point that if you really think about actually the places, from Afghanistan, for example, or Libya, or of course Syria, where most of the migrants are coming from, actually, it's extraordinary to think that they're really just interested in a moment of possible upward social mobility. Those are all desperately brutalized, collapsing states from which actually there seemed to be no possibility of normal life. It's and the notion that, first of all, I dispute those figures about actually the 77%, as I say. And it seems to me, if you're actually a family in terrible distress, and haven't we all seen, as Louise mentioned, dinghies and rubber crafts full of children, as well as, with their elder brothers and fathers. So families are desperately trying to make it, often at the cost of their own lives. But supposing actually most of the people who are coming over, more than half are males, and this fits with the fact that more than half of those in displaced, horrible camps like Atma, where there are 58,000 people stuck there in Syria with desperate shortages, no sanitation, shortages of food and medicine. It'd be logical to send your brothers and uncles and the men to see that's how it was actually in the 1880s and 1990s. And all of those men weren't arriving with the purpose of upping their rape score either.
Simon, we're going to have lots of time in the cross-examination to get into these issues, but I want to come over to the other side, and Mark Steyn, get your quick reaction to what you've heard.
Hey, I made a decision tonight that I wasn't going to do funny stuff. I was going to be deadly serious, and I'm slightly amazed at our colleagues' ability to get big laughs on gang rape. Madame Arbour scoffs at the newfound feminists over here. I'm not much of a feminist, but I draw the line at the 3-year-old getting raped and the 7-year-old getting gang raped in a basement. And when Simon tells us that, funnily enough, we're all obsessed, maybe we don't get enough action in the Toronto singles bars. Madame Arbour, as she said, is a feminist of a certain generation. And those feminists were very clear, as Madame Arbour was very clear in Sudan, that rape is not about sex, whatever Simon may say. Rape is about power. which is what Madame Arbour says. And we're not talking about the kind of sex I want to have. I ain't into 3-year-old girls. But the 14-year-old girl in Sudan, here's a random example from 10 days of German migrant crimes in January. 16-year-old boy raped inside Wolfsburg City Hall. 13-year-old girl sexually assaulted near a railway station in Ellwagen. 3 girls sexually assaulted at a swimming pool in Ansbach. 15-year-old girl raped at a railway station in Wuppertal. Attempted gang rape of a 13-year-old girl in Gelsenkirchen. I can go on and on. These are all rapes, gang rapes in public places. Trains, streets, parks, and even City Hall. And I congratulate you on getting big laughs with that, Simon, and you, Louise, because if I'd known that, I'd be doing open night mic on gang rape at a comedy club. It isn't funny. It isn't funny.
Okay, Mark, we'll be able to get into this later. Your time is up.
And it gets to the heart of the question.
Your time is up here. You're going to have to sit down.
It gets to the heart of the question.
In the moderated cross-examination. Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be harder than the election debate. I thought that was tough, but this is going to be a real challenge. Nigel, you're up next for your rebuttal.
Thank you. What Mark has just said is difficult to listen to, and we'd all rather pretend it isn't happening. But sadly, it is happening. Simon, you're in denial. I'll tell you what's sad. What's sad, and you'd know as an historian, is that 100 years ago, the women went into the factories, earned their first decent pay packets, went to the pub, got the vote. We've lived through 100 years of female liberation and emancipation, and now we have the mayors of towns in Germany and in Sweden and in other parts of Northern Europe telling women not to walk out after dark on their own. And in the wake of the Cologne sex attacks, the mayor of Cologne said to those women, they really ought to dress differently and behave differently in public. That, Simon, is what is sad. And actually, I find the sheer hypocrisy of those of you that have stood up and said you're going to defend female rights when actually you think migrant rights are more important than female rights in our own community. Frankly, shame on you. And Louise, you're trying to redefine the 1951 Convention on Refugee Status. But can I just challenge you to something? You know, maybe, just maybe, you would agree with me that the Australians, when they faced a similar problem of people coming in boats in large numbers, of sinkings and drownings, maybe the Australians got it right when they said nobody will qualify as a refugee if they come through this route, but we will process people offshore, genuinely and sincerely, and if they are people who, because of their race, religion, or political beliefs, qualify as refugees, we in Australia will have them. Wouldn't it make more sense, Louise, rather than having an open door to the Greek islands, to process people in North Africa and the Middle East?
Okay. Very good. Now we're going to move on to our moderated portion of the discussion. We'll get into some of the issues that have been raised to date. It's been a hot exchange so far, and I want to give Louise and Simon an opportunity to respond to that latest rebuttals we've heard. And Louise, because you were mentioned last here by Nigel, let's have you respond first. And maybe specifically to this idea of whether Australia, very different than what's happening in Europe, is a model that should be considered.
Yeah, well, Nigel, it will come as no surprise to you that I can't think of much that I would agree with you on tonight. This is not one of them. Australia is hardly a model of compliance with the Refugee Convention. I mentioned before one of the key features of the Refugee Convention, and bear with me for a minute. Let's assume that we have a genuine asylum seeker, as opposed to a gang rapist. Just for the sake of argument, let's just start with a neutral proposition. Somebody's knocking on the door. The Refugee Convention assumes that this asylum seeker will have to flee his or her territory, probably by non-legal means. That's why we have irregular people. They enter either with no documentation, or through means, because there are no open channels for these people to escape their predicament. The duty on the country of transit or destination is to have a fair and humane process to determine the bona fides of their refugee claim. And Australia exporting that responsibility in the same way, actually, that the United States, not on refugee issues, but it's exporting to Mexico its processing of migrants who come from Latin America. This is not the way to do it. The way to do it is for countries to receive people on the assumption, actually, that they may very well be people fleeing persecution and have a fair process in their country, particularly rich countries like ours, like Australia, like the US, who have full capacity to do that in a very decent, humane fashion. And unfortunately, that's not the example that Australia has set out.
But how can Greece cope with this? This is the point, isn't it? That actually what Greece, I mean, some people have gone to Italy, and I understand that, but actually it's Greece that has faced just a vast number of people. There is no particular sign of it stopping. A so-called deal with Turkey has seen routes from Libya opening up again. Surely the point is that of the 1 million people that came through the Greek islands last year and finished up settling in Germany, virtually none of them were properly processed, and not one of them was security screened. And I wonder, under the 1951 definition of refugee status, how many of that 1 million that went to Germany last year would have qualified as refugees? 5%? 10% maximum? This is what I'm saying. This whole debate, we're talking about the global refugee crisis. I do understand there are dreadful things happening in North Africa and the Middle East. But what I'm talking about is we broaden the definitions of what a refugee is to a level where we cannot accept, European countries will not accept numbers on this basis. 1.8 million last year, it'll be 1.8 million this year, and 1.8 million next year, and the people in the end simply won't accept it.
Nigel, there are 500 million people in Europe. You think Europe doesn't have it's not the lack of capacity, it's a lack of political will, in large part because the entire public debate is poisoned by the kind of discourse that we've heard about tonight. We're supposed to talk about refugees, we talk about gang rape.
We would.
Okay,
no,
let's, hold on a second.
We would, of course, there is room in our hearts for Europe, from all of Europe, to give people refugee status. We just want to know that they're genuine refugees and not people coming to do us harm. That's all we want to know.
Okay. I want to bring Simon in on this, and then I'll come to you, Mark.
Well, I actually don't disagree with you about the need for better screening. I don't disagree with that at all. I just want to say, though, to Mark's fulmination, that it's an appalling slander to me to the Muslim religion to imply, actually, that, well, wasn't it saying...
I never said the word Muslim in my fulmination. It was a Muslim-free fulmination.
No, the assumption... What did you just say? I didn't hear that. I didn't hear what you said, anyway. But, no, the implication was that if you've got a Muslim immigrant, he, and it's going to be he, is bound to commit a sexual crime sooner or later. That seems to be a monstrous and grotesque falsehood about Muslim communities that have been settled for a long time now in Britain and the United States. Dearborn, Michigan is not full. Dearborn, Michigan...
Well, I will give you a Muslim fulmination then. Muslim men are about 1.5% to 2% of the population in Norway. They account for half of all the rape convictions in Oslo. There are differences here. There are cultural differences. And I think if you think about it...
What is it about Islam that you're saying actually is designed to make men brutal sexual animals?
I'm not talking...
And why then don't you want to deport all Muslims from Europe and the Western societies?
Because I distinguish. I agree. You're a historian. You know as well as I do how many more Muslim men in the First and Second World Wars fought for king and empire than Canadians. Muslims have a long tradition of loyalty to the crown and service to the crown. They were getting Victoria Crosses for extraordinary courage on the battlefield 100 years ago today during the Great War. You know that. What has changed is that we are no longer importing someone who had been to a Muslim at school in India in 1948, 1949 would have received an education not different by that much from a grade schooler in Canada or in
Mark,
Scotland
you've got to
or
tell us
anywhere else.
where you're going with this, because you're losing me. What's the point?
I'm saying I'm just establishing my non-Islamophobic bona fide.
Consider it done.
But there is an issue.
Yeah.
Let's move back onto refugees, because this debate is about the refugee crisis.
Right.
That's our focus tonight. There are other dimensions. We'll continue to get into them. But, Louise, I want to come to you and pick up a little bit on what Mark and Nigel have been saying, which is certain societies are better at integrating people than others. Traditionally, Canada thinks that it's done a pretty good job. The United States is called the melting pot. European countries often are not very good at integration. Therefore, is this a different kind of crisis? Is this time different?
I think Europe has done, and here we might have, I suspect and hope, a bit of agreement. I think Europe has done a pitiful job at forthrightly defending the virtues and moral decencies and political traditions of Western pluralist, liberal capitalist democracy. Europe is essentially an organization managing the business cycle and hoping for the best when it comes to shopping for Christmas. And that is an abject surrender. If we are ever going to make any headway against militant apocalyptic Salafism, there has to be something to offer the refugee population, whether they're, wherever they come from, whether they're from South Sahara Africa. And it's as though that wasn't part of what we need to do. We need to be less defensive, less mute, less muffled. They should be reading Locke and Milton and Mill and, making that tradition as passionately important and a stake in citizenship is as important as screening and putting up walls and, having decent counter-terrorist intelligence. I don't know, maybe...
I agree with you completely. Yeah. We have been abject, pathetic. We've lain prostrate on the floor. We've allowed people to come in, change large parts of our communities and our cities, and nobody amongst our leadership, and this is not about getting religious in government, but no one's had the guts and the courage to stand up for our Christian culture, because that's
I don't want to
who we
hear
are.
Christian.
Because
I don't want to hear Christian. I happen to be Jewish. Well, there was nothing.
Well, we come from. Well, as you well know, it is a Judeo-Christian culture, right? And that is our culture.
There's no such thing as Judeo-Christian culture.
As soon as
you either believe Jesus is the Messiah or you don't.
As soon as I start to talk about real values, you shrink into your shell like everybody else, don't you? We have our Judeo-Christian culture. We have been gutless and weak in defending it. But the real problem here is we can look back at various migratory waves, various refugee waves, and the problem is this. Mark isn't suggesting that Islam's a bad religion. I'm certainly not suggesting that, but I am saying that what Wahhabism has done, funded by the Saudi Arabians, has been a cancer within Islam.
Absolutely,
all right?
agree.
And, the 1974 boom in the oil price has led to so much of what we're all suffering. But here's the problem, and here's why we're nervous and we're cautious about opening up our doors to untold millions of people from those countries. It is that never before, integration may have been difficult, but never before have we had to live with the fifth column, living inside our own communities and our own country that want to kill us, blow us up, and change our way of life. And I'm arguing for having a sensible refugee policy, but we must be able to screen people before they come to settle in our countries. Okay. Surely that's just plain common sense.
I'm going to come to Louise on this point, and then I'll go to you, Mark.
Well, the first thing, again, we have to be very careful not to exaggerate. I think that's exactly the trap, is to exaggerate the sense of danger and fear that this idea of infiltration can generate. A couple of things. If we had assumed that most Italians coming to this country, for instance, would be members of the mafia, or most Asians would be members of triads, I've said that a million times, we would have closed the door. There is no basis upon which to suggest that the people who are fleeing the atrocious events in Syria, in Libya, to take these two, in northern Iraq and so on, that these people are missiles that are being sent to infiltrate our communities. You know what? It's going to be a lot easier, and I really believe that it's part of a very sophisticated strategic plan by those who are intent on destroying our democracies to tease us into an irrational response where we will destroy the very values we believe in. We will over-securitize, and inevitably we will use security measures in discriminatory fashion with carding and racial profiling and so on. Slowly, we will destroy our very values out of the sheer fear that they're coming in to do it for us. We're going to do it to ourselves if we cultivate this culture of fear with an overreaction, restriction on freedoms, over-securitize, and targeting these vulnerable minorities rather than protecting them and including them.
Mark. Well, we are getting to the meat of it now, and that the question is, people talk about European values, British values, Canadian values, without ever defining it. And I think, Simon is right, that it's not just about car chase movies and rap songs and all the rest of it. There's something underlying it. I share entirely Louise's fears of the big security state, because I like to write and I like to say what I want. And my writing wound up in front of 3 human rights commissions in Canada. So I certainly don't want to see the Europeans erect a bigger security state with less free speech than Canada has. I would hate to see that. But the reality of this situation is that if you look at what happened with the Charlie Hebdo slaughter in Paris a year ago, and then look at the polls of the Muslim communities afterwards, they don't want to put a bullet in a cartoonist, they don't want to blow up the Brussels airport, but there is no commitment to traditional Western understanding of free speech, and as Simon says, we don't teach them it. We don't assimilate them. You have to have something to assimilate with. And if you don't, you have bicultural societies, as you dealt with in Bosnia. Bicultural societies are always fundamentally unstable. Sometimes more or less benignly so, like Northern Ireland, sometimes genocidally so, as Louise can tell you, in Rwanda. But if you don't assimilate these people coming in Europe, then you will have bicultural societies, and they will tear Europe apart.
Hold on. Mark, I assume it's been a long time since you've lived in Toronto. Is that a fair assumption? Have you seen street signs in languages you can't understand? This is the city we live in. We're not scared.
No, this is a I was born in Toronto. I've been away for a couple of years. You're from Quebec. You're from Quebec. So you know as well as I do that the differences between Quebec Francophones and Ontario Anglophones are footling in the scheme of things. Yet 20 years ago, a majority of your fellow Quebec Francophones voted that they didn't want to be in the same country as these guys. And you're saying that somehow...
Talk to him about that.
You're saying that somehow in Germany or in Sweden or in Molenbeek, the Islamic Emirate inside of the Kingdom of Belgium, 25% of the population of Brussels is Muslim. You're trying to tell us that they will be more fundamentally stable and secure than Northern Ireland?
Well, I think the divisions in Belgium, they don't have to wait for anybody coming out of that country to have separatist tendencies. They have I lived in Belgium, in Brussels, for 5 years until recently, so they don't need anybody to come from any stan to have identity
I know. My mum's
difficulties.
Flemish. I know about that.
Exactly.
Well, England's fairly united. I mean, Scotland, not always, I would agree. But England's pretty united. But the point Mark's making is very interesting. We have actually got now, within England, the growth of a parallel society. 80% of Muslim marriages in Britain are not recognised under UK law. They're conducted under Muslim law, which of course gives the women far fewer rights than they would have under UK law. We now have 83 Sharia courts existing in England. We now have tens of thousands of cases of female genital mutilation taking place every single year in England, which we think of as a country perhaps not with as big a problems as some of the others. And yet there's not yet been one prosecution within our system. So Simon and I have got some degree of agreement on this, that the law has to be, equal, applied equally to everybody. We mustn't be scared of applying the law equally to ethnic minorities. If we are, we're storing up massive problems for the future. But Louise, I'm sorry, you're trying to compare some of the concerns that we've got on this side of the debate with previous migrations. It's not an exaggeration, the word you used. It's not an exaggeration unless you think the boss of Europol is wrong. Should we be concerned when he tells us there are 5,000 jihadists, stroke terrorists, that have come into Europe in the last 18 months through the Greek islands posing as refugees? Should we be concerned? You bet your life we should be concerned. Only 8 of them killed 130 people in Paris. We have a problem here. Get out of denial, please.
Yes, but the deep problem is that jihadi cells exist. For example, the San Bernardino shooting was a case in point. The main shooter at San Bernardino was an American citizen. Mm-hmm. His wife had a green card. A very significant number of those who are actually carrying out these appallingly homicidal conspiracies are British and American and French and Belgians. Now, again, I think we're agreed that there's an appalling degree of criminal negligence on the part, particularly the Belgian authorities, in not noticing when somebody's deported from Turkey to the Netherlands and is known as a terrorist, not actually picking that information up. But if you're going to do something about homegrown Salafist jihadism, you have to engage with the Muslim community, not demonize it en masse. You actually have to welcome the work of the Quilliam Foundation.
Yeah, well, I do.
You have to start from the assumption, not from the pessimistic assumption that all Muslim immigrants or refugees are necessarily going to constitute a fifth column, but the possibility at least that they can lead active, decent lives of citizens. I don't disagree with you about the horror of genital mutilation and honor killings. Those should be prosecuted.
Simon,
you're absolutely right.
I'm with you on this. We have
right
a problem already within our countries. What I'm urging is we don't have a complete open door to all the huddled masses, so we make a problem that we already have even worse. That's the point.
I know. I agree with you about
debate.
screening, but that's already gone. That's already gone. The EU-Turkey agreement is going to return, vast numbers who land in Greece. Although I want to say,
and then let 77 million Turks
I just want to
join
add
the EU.
a piece. Pardon?
And then let 77 million Turks join the EU and have free movement. It's hardly a victory, is it?
No, I'm not.
I mean, if that's a victory, I'd hate to see what a defeat looks like. Right here, Riley.
But
it is incredibly ironic.
Simon's point is right here. When you've got second and third generation Belgians and Frenchmen and Germans and Britons and Canadians going off to join ISIS, blowing up Paris, blowing up Brussels, that ought to occasion a certain modesty among us, that our skills at assimilation, at inculcating our values, are not as awesome and all-encompassing as they were in the 19th century. And the answer, when second and third generation immigrants are blowing up the airport, that suddenly that's the reason to accelerate immigration from the same source, is very bizarre. In what sense are these people Belgian?
In what sense is Raisa Iqbal British? she's fully British, right?
Yes,
and
she's fully British.
And she happens to be a British Muslim,
yes.
right?
I worked
how more
years ago
British can
with-
you get than doing, the BBC World Service?
Yeah, I worked with Zainab Badawi at Channel 4 in Britain. I've got no problem with that. But that's my point. Holding a passport does not make you Canadian and does not make you Belgian and does not make you French.
I agree. I think what maybe we both want to see is some way, but this is the difference between us, I think, actually. What I think and Louise want to see is, because as Louise said at the end of her remarks, we're already a globally interconnected world on a shrinking planet. There are those of us who essentially are possibly naively optimistic humanists who think it not impossible to be an Orthodox Muslim and a good Canadian or a good Brit, a good Democrat at the same time. And for that, you need to be, involved and engaged to a degree which actually hasn't happened in exercises of civic education, which make it clear that you can indeed go to a mosque on Friday for Friday prayers and still be a decent, democratically participating citizen. If you go to the mosque and the imam happens to preach the destruction of the society that you're living in, bloody well turn him in. Turn him in.
Mark, that doesn't happen, unfortunately. And if you look at the Mountie statistics of radicalized mosques, you'll understand that all over this city and Montreal and Calgary and Edmonton and Vancouver, there are any number of radicalized mosques where people just sit on their hands. The thing is, I go back to my point, Simon, that you have to have something to assimilate with.
Yes.
Most of the history the people in British schools haven't a clue about. They don't have a clue about. They don't teach history in North American schools. My kids are in some school where it's called social studies, and they do a little bit of it, and it's always the same thing. It's Martin Luther King comes around like the number 23 bus.
I actually have a movement to abolish the term.
Yeah, well, good for you. I'll sign that petition.
Can I sign you up?
Yeah. Okay. I want to move on to numbers, because that's a big part of this debate. We're seeing countries, not simply in the Middle East, Turkey, 2.7 million, Lebanon, 1 million. Nigel, if you look at Great Britain in terms of legally settled Syrian refugees, almost infinitesimal numbers compared to your European counterparts. What does Britain, what does Canada, what does the United States owe its European allies in terms of trying to take the pressure that you've diagnosed, you and Mark have diagnosed, is so acute within their societies right now? What do we owe them?
Well, we have a problem in the United Kingdom with this, because we, having never had this before, we now have an open door to 500 million people who are European Union citizens. And as a result of that, and generally a pretty weak UK immigration policy, net migration to Britain is running at 1/3 of a million a year. That's if you believe the figures, which I really honestly don't. So we've got our population increasing by 1/3 of a million every year, 10 times the post-war average, and it's because of that that David Cameron has said he's only going to accept 20,000 Syrian refugees over the course of this Parliament. I'm absolutely certain that if the United Kingdom had an Australian-style point system for immigration, and we had net migration running at average post-war levels of 30,000 a year, we'd find room for some more genuine refugees. And I hope when we did that, we'd look at the plight of the Christians who are being massacred in Libya and in Iraq and Syria, and who, from every definition, and you shake your head at me, it fascinates me, from every definition that the United Nations has stood for since 1951, those Christians I would have thought should be guaranteed freedom and security and refugee status in the West. And so I think in Britain, and actually now in Germany and Sweden, we're actually becoming very hard-hearted because of free movement of people. Because of Schengen, in the case of those countries, we're actually becoming rather hard-hearted to things that 20 years ago we'd have been happy to accept.
Okay. Mark, on a United States on a population of over 300 million, only 1,200 Syrian refugees have been legally and officially admitted into the country. Again, is that the United States shouldering its burden of this crisis?
No, but they don't look at it principally in a humanitarian way. They see it as part of the big security picture. And it's a little surreal to be holding this debate in the week following Brussels, which is what the question would mean if we discussed it in the United States. Because Louise and Simon, I think, want to detach the general migration question from the terrorism question. And the Americans in particular don't see it that way. We all know, I mean, I was glad to hear that the zealots of Canadian customs turned over Simon at Pearson earlier today. It's good to know there's always someone they don't want to let in the country. And the fascinating thing is, when you look at what Mr. McCallum is going to say, he goes, well, we're not going to have the chaps committing the gang rapes. No, we're screening for them. We're screening for them. No Western government, if you have ever had the pleasure of undergoing so-called secondary interrogation, as this suspicious character did earlier today, you will know that no Western government has a clue about who it lets in. The person who committed the San Bernardino crime, as you say, she had a green card. She basically used a jihadist dating site to put together a terrorist cell. It was an arranged marriage for the purpose of committing terrorism. And she aced something, because it's money, no object down south. It's not like here where there's just, whatever it's called this week, the CBSA. There's just one little agency dealing with it. They've got like 97 agencies south of the border looking at this woman. She aced 5 separate tests, and she still got into the country. America takes the view it has no idea who any of these people are, and better be safe than sorry.
Great. Let's come back now to you, Louise. What does North America, what does Canada, the United States owe in terms of its share of this crisis?
Well, I think we have to bring this debate a little bit back into less apocalyptic scale. First of all, and maybe the wording of the motion, I said at the beginning, was a poetic way of capturing the spirit and the letter of the Refugee Convention. But I think we've drifted now into the movement of people, in fact, which are for the most part unregulated by international law, international treaty. What we're talking about now, the so-called huge crisis that Europe is facing, is very well defined by the Refugee Convention. We haven't made a dent in talking about the millions of stateless people in the world who don't have a passport. And by the way, Mark, if you have a Canadian passport, you're a Canadian citizen. There's no other thing, right? So we haven't made a dent into dealing with statelessness. We haven't made a dent in talking about what are called IDPs, internally displaced persons, of which there are millions in Syria itself, in Sudan. These people are stuck in their own country against a predatory government. We have no framework to deal with them and to help them. What we're talking about are people running away from oppression, and frankly, we have to assume, when you consider immense risk that they're taking to flee, that at least the majority of them are bona fide refugee applicants. And then we have to process it. So we're talking about a very small numbers. When we say millions, it's millions knocking on the door of 1 billion people, if you put Europe, North America, all the world's capacity of the wealthy nations together. The key, I believe, is international cooperation. There's no reason Greece, which was having a lot of financial problems itself, should have been stuck with bearing the largest burden. The European partners and the Western countries generally should have stepped up to the plate, and I think Canada should still do so beyond the already generous signal that we have already sent. Sure. We have the luxury, actually, in Canada, of doing a full pre-screening. They don't row into Canada. They sit in refugee camps where we have months and months through UNHCR to do pre-selection processes. With the luxury of these processes in place, we should be doing tons more. But then everybody has to work in that direction and stop the exaggeration not the non-existence of security risk. I'm not saying there is zero risk, but to blow it up to such an extent that we start talking about erecting walls with barbed wires, I think this will be actually a stain and a shame on our generation, if that's our response.
Okay. We're coming to the end of our cross-examination period, but Simon, I want to give you the last word in this segment, and then we'll go into closing statements.
Oh, I just want to really echo what Louise said, and I just want to say just a quick piece of information that came out today, a report from Amnesty International, which casts a very long shadow over the Turkey-EU agreement, if that's going to happen. And the report from Amnesty International, which is very, very credible, by the way, says that Turkey has been forcibly deporting refugees, Syrian refugees, back to the war zones from which they've come, and which is a horrific thing to contemplate, if true. The Turks have denied this, but there seems to be a very substantial amount of evidence, and it throws the issue back to the place perhaps we should have spent more time on, as Louise suggested, that there is this kind of universe of misery and suffering, especially 1 in every 3 displaced person in these hellish camps in Syria, some in Jordan and Lebanon, are children. And we have to really think about their plight rather than obsess quite so much on jihadis and rapists in German cities.
Very good. Okay. It's time now for closing statements. We're going to proceed in the opposite order of our opening statements. So, Nigel, your 3 minutes will go up on the clock, and you have the stage.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and thank you for a very civilized debate. We started off with 77% against our side of the argument, which compared to the odds I'm against when I'm in the European Parliament, strikes me as being quite a good start. I've tried tonight to make the point that I do think it's beholden upon people in the West to open their hearts to genuine refugees, people who are in fear of direct persecution, imprisonment and death because of their race, their religion, their political beliefs, indeed their sexual orientation. I've tried to make that point, and I've no doubt that America and Canada could do an awful lot more than they're doing. I've no doubt about that when it comes to refugees. But it's Europe that has faced the front line of this over the course of the last 18 months. And what we have done is we've thrown out of the window our classical definition of what a refugee is, and we've broadened it to anybody coming from a war-torn area, or frankly anybody coming from a poor country. What Mrs. Merkel did clearly was irresponsible, damn stupid, and is a price that Germany will have to pay for many years to come. Just opening up your doors and not being able, in a modern world where we do have a genuine terrorist threat, and yes, it's about 2%, probably, of the Muslim communities that are coming into Europe. But if only 8 people can cause all that misery in Paris and half a dozen what we saw in Brussels, we have to be careful. We have to have security checks. We have to process people offshore and make sure they're genuine refugees. And I've tried this evening to challenge the other side to see whether they would agree with me that the Christians who are being crucified and massacred in the Middle East should qualify for refugee status. And I've not had one positive response from the other side on this at all. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the point. This motion, you cannot support this motion. It is idealized nonsense. It doesn't make sense. What we need to have is a sensible, proper, common sense refugee policy to help those who are in peril. But just to open up our doors the way Angela Merkel did is bad news for Germany and is bad news for the West, and we need to stand up and stop such nonsense. Oppose the motion, please. Thank you.
I want to say I don't disagree at all with your point about the Christian community. ditto Yazidis and persecuted Shia. As far as the Islamic State is concerned, Shia aren't Muslim at all. So I want to end with the words of a Christian, not mine, written in 1624. You all know some of them, at least, I'm sure. The Dean of St. Paul's, John Donne. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends were. Any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. Tolls for thee.
Louise, we're going to go to Mark, and you'll get the last word. Mark?
Those of us on the stage and many of the more distinguished persons in the auditorium tonight lead privileged lives. Privileged lives. We jet off to the European Parliament in Strasbourg, to BBC television studios, to the transnational bureaucracy in Geneva. And it's easy from 30,000 feet to think that what's going on below us is swell. We will never have to live in Molenbeek in Brussels or Rosengard in Malmo. We will never have to live in Bradford or Toulouse. We get to go to the nice places. And that should occasion in us a certain modesty when we come up with grand utopian schemes that testify to what Simon called, I think, our naively optimistic humanism. Because down there in Molenbeek and in Rosengard, they have to live with the consequences of our attitudes, of our naively optimistic humanism. We are striking attitudes. Simon talked earlier, I think, about his Kurdish newsagent, who's always a very decent chap when he hands him the Jewish Chronicle in the morning. We all know people like that. But at the same time, the political class is designing a solution to the great migrations of the world that will only end in tragedy. And I ask you not to vote for it. The more failed states that stay failed, the more failed states there will be. So ultimately, it is better for Syrians to be able to live in Syria, for Afghans to be able to live in Afghanistan, for Iraqis to be able to live in Iraq. It is better for there to be more beacons of liberty around the world. I confess, I've never liked the Emma Lazarus poem that is stapled to the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. The French gave the Americans a fabulous Statue of Liberty, and the Americans nailed a third-rate poem to it and turned it into a celebration of mass migration. Liberty and mass migration have nothing to do with each other. And often, in fact, the latter can imperil the former. And that is where Simon's naively optimistic humanism may take us. We cannot fix failed states by inviting millions of their people to move in with us. All that ensures is more failed states, more failure, and eventually, one by one, the nations of the West will join them. And then you'll really be yearning to breathe free, and there'll be nowhere to do it. Please vote against this motion.
Ms. Arbour, you'll have the last word.
All right. Well, let me say at the outset that I don't know of any evidence that suggests that Christians from Syria or Druze or Alawites have been excluded from refugee protection. I don't know where this is all coming from. I think what at the bottom of today's debate, is showing that what is being portrayed today as unique is in fact just another manifestation of the old myths and stereotypes and prejudices that have met virtually every wave of immigration, and it's particularly odious when it targets refugees, not just any other kind of migrants. In fact, Doug Saunders, in his book and in a piece that he wrote in the Globe and Mail, made the point that, in fact, many of the things that we hear today about Muslim refugees penetrating our Western societies with a fifth column intent on destroying it, in fact, many of the characteristics that we attribute to them were attributed sometimes in relatively recent parts of our histories to Catholics, for instance, who were said to be backwards, had a loyalty to Rome more than to their home country, lived in poor, crime-ridden neighborhoods, were very backwards, anti-democratic, authoritarian by disposition. Doesn't that sound also like the yellow peril, that we were all going to be transformed into a different society? We'll all end up being of a mixed color if we let in these millions of people coming from all over the world. This plays into exactly the same stereotypes and myths that we've heard at every single point in history. The reality is, despite an original knee-jerk, at times very hostile reception to newcomers, the history in this country has been a history of immense success, of integrating people coming from all kinds of different cultures and religion. And when I talk about integration, it is a two-way street. It has changed us, and it will change us in the future. We have to have a very impoverished confidence in our democracy to think that it is so fragile that it cannot sustain the profound differences that will challenge us through our devotion to free speech, freedom of assembly, and pluralism. Thank you. I believe we're okay.
I know. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it was a hard-fought debate tonight, and it reminds me of something that our founder, Peter Munk, has said on many occasions. It's one thing to get up and give a speech, to have the stage as yours for 45 minutes or an hour. It's something very different, what we've seen tonight. Four big minds, four big thinkers, challenging each other, putting their ideas out there, and contesting this important issue. So please join me in a show of appreciation for a phenomenal debate from these debaters. Bravo. Very well done. Very well done. Thank you. Bravo. Okay, let's take a look at where public opinion was at in this hall at the beginning of this evening, because all of you in the audience here are going to have the opportunity on your way out of the hall to vote again. So let's take a look at where audience was at the beginning of tonight. 77% of you agreeing with the motion, 23% opposed. Then we asked you how many would be open to changing your mind to get a sense of the degree to which this debate was in place. 79% yes. So it's going to be fascinating to see how all of you decide, based on what you've heard tonight, the arguments pro and con, where you will come down on this debate. I just want to end by, again, thanking the Aurea Foundation for staging these phenomenal debates. They're a great part of Toronto, a great part of Canada, and this evening, something that's been available to people from coast to coast in Canada and across the continental United States. We're going to do this all again next autumn, but in the meantime, keep watching, keep learning, keep reading. Thank you for joining us at the Munk Debates. Thank you.